I'm Laura, the coordinator for Danwadaag Durable Solutions Consortium, focused on building long-term solutions to displacement and progress towards reintegration in Somalia. We're delighted to welcome you here today for what is the first of a series of 3 learning events. Today we will be focusing on housing, land and property, and we really organised these series of events to ensure that there was a platform for us to be able to disseminate the learning and the evidence from the past 4 years of implementation from the consortium. So once again, thank you for joining us, and we're delighted that you could be here with us. I'm going to begin with just an outline of what we're doing here, why we've organised the event, and a little bit about Danwadaag, the consortium itself, just to give you a bit of background. I'm then going to be handing over to my colleague, Shezane from the Norwegian Refugee Council, who will be talking through the details of Danwadaag's housing, land and property investments. Shezane will then hand over to Andrew from the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat, and my colleague Lena from the Danwadaag Consortium Leadership Team to focus on the last 2 sections, looking at learning and solutions, and also the collective opportunities that we have moving forwards. And as I mentioned previously, we will end with a good chunk of a Q&A session to give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have or make any comments. And we would really love to encourage you to use your voice in the chat box and to really engage with the material as we move through. So first of all, what are we all doing here? What's the purpose of the event? So for us, Danwadaag is almost 4 years old now, from design through to implementation, and now we are currently closing out the first phase of the program at the end of this month. From the outset, we have had a core commitment to learning embedded into our theory of change. Learning not only to influence our own work, our own program through cyclical feedback loops, but also to help others that are also engaged in durable solutions programming, policy and investments within Somalia and even beyond that within the region. And what we also feel very passionately about as well is using our own learning and evidence from 4 years of implementation to also support the government, given their primary responsibility for solutions, to support them in their leadership role for coordination and design of durable solutions in Somalia. So that's really what this event stemmed from. And this specifically will focus on housing, land and property, or HLP, as it's commonly referred to. Housing, land and property is something that we have recognised through Danwadaag's programming is absolutely critical to achieving long-term solutions in Somalia. One of the things that we noticed really through the first year or 18 months of implementation was how much of a shock forced evictions are to the people that we were serving through the program. Forced evictions are arguably the largest shock that IDPs in urban centres will face in Somalia, really resulting in them going back to square one and having to build resilience and coping capacities really from the ground up again. So our ability to mitigate this, to be able to provide other solutions and also be able to strengthen people's land tenure security really plays an integral role in actually being able to achieve these solutions for the longer term. So that's why we felt that rather than having a very broad-based learning event, we actually wanted to really deep dive into housing, land and property. Again, to really focus on the learning and the evidence coming from our programming with a view to supporting the wider learning on housing, land and property in Somalia and also beyond. So again, recognising that housing, land and property rights and violations and inadequate city planning are one of the most pressing threats to durable solutions in Somalia today. And recognizing alongside that the majority of displacement, 80% of displacement in Somalia, is to urban centers. So right now we have 2.9 million IDPs is the latest estimated figures in Somalia. 80% of those are in these primary urban centers. So that's about 2.3 million IDPs in these urban centers. And that is increasing, particularly as we know, Somalia is in the middle of what is a very severe drought, and the IDP figures in these centers is increasing every day. So finding solutions that make sense, not just in the short term, but also in the longer term, that are more sustainable, is absolutely critical to being able to reduce displacement figures moving forwards. So before I move on to talk a little bit more about Danwadaag and who we are as a consortium, we wanted to just take a little bit of a step back and share with you a very interesting video from the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat, which focuses on understanding housing, land and property in Somalia.
To begin with, the concept of HLP includes the full spectrum of rights related to housing, land and property held according to statutory or customary laws. HLP rights are therefore about having a home, free from the fear of forced evictions, and a place that offers shelter, safety, and the ability to secure a livelihood. HLP rights are referenced and defined in several international human rights instruments that include universally recognized human rights, particularly the right to adequate housing. It is important to note that housing is much more than a wall around or a roof over one's head. It comprises adequacy, which means fulfilling one's psychological, physical, and social needs. In most countries, HLP rights can be exercised through different forms of land tenure arrangements, mainly categorized as formal rights, for example, with formal documents such as title deeds. These, however, are rare, particularly in fragile contexts. Secondly, customary rights, which are administered by customary institutions such as chiefs or traditional leaders. And lastly, user rights, which include a wide range of HLP options such as rental agreements, rights of use, rights to plant and harvest, rights to access water sources, rights of passing through, and so forth. User rights can either be individual or collective. We need to remember that all persons still retain HLP rights regardless of the land tenure arrangements. IDPs living in informal settlements may therefore not possess a legal right to occupy the land, but still possess the right to adequate housing and the protection against forced evictions. In Somalia, however, security of tenure is fragile, as there are poor land registries documenting ownership of land and limited capacity from administrative and judicial institutions to protect the various agreements over land and housing through the court system. IDPs and women are also less likely to obtain justice from customary or religious dispute resolution bodies. Women face specific forms of discrimination in relation to issues of inheritance and divorce. As women are excluded from both shaping the rules of the system as well as acting as decision makers in the face of disputes, this leaves them with little recourse in the face of HLP violations. Additionally, most IDPs live in cramped settlements under unsanitary conditions and without sufficient access to basic services. Majority also live on private or unregistered land and face a continuing threat of forced evictions from private landowners and gatekeepers when they seek to reclaim the land. In 2019 alone, more than 170,000 individuals were evicted across Somalia. Usually, those affected do not receive prior notice, their shelters are destroyed, and they are left on their own to find a new place in the city to live.
Great, thanks very much everyone. So hopefully you found that video informative and it gave you a bit more of a sense of why housing, land and property is so critical. So before I move on to really outline a little bit more about Danwadaag, I really just wanted to take a moment to emphasize then why we feel that this housing, land and property component is so critical. the sustainable reintegration of internally displaced persons, IDPs, is not attainable without adequate access to housing, land, and improved housing and land, and improved security of land tenure and protection from forced evictions. And the government has made substantial progress in Somalia, which has been incredibly encouraging to see, towards establishing conditions that enable housing, land, and property solutions in terms of formulating a number of policies, but we still have a great deal of work to do together. Again, donors have continued to invest in multi-generational durable solutions programming, which is very positive. But again, we need to do more together. And this event, this session that we're going to spend time on today, will hopefully outline to you some of the ways that you can also get involved in ensuring that housing, land, and property is an integral part of durable solutions moving forwards for Somalia. It's just a little bit about Danwadaag, the Durable Solutions Consortium itself. Some of you may already be familiar with us, but the consortium is made up of 7 like-minded partners, 3 national and 4 international agencies. We're hosted by IOM Somalia, so we are unique in that we are a UN NGO consortium. We have been collectively working on solutions to displacement in Somalia since 2018, but I would like to highlight that we consider ourselves to be a 3rd generation durable solutions consortium, and that we're very much based on the learning and the gains of programs that have come before. So the EU funded RENTEG consortiums, and also the MIDNEMO program, a UN Habitat and IOM collaboration. Both of those programs in itself gave us very valuable learning in order to build the logic model and the theory of change for Danwadaag, and to ensure that our program was very much based on evidence coming from the field before us. This first phase of Danwadaag, as I mentioned earlier, it will end actually at the end of this month of March 2022, and we have been funded to this point by UK Aid, or FCDO. As I mentioned, we're UN-led, and we're partnering with a coalition of international and national NGOs that really brings a wealth of expertise and contextual experience to the table. So what we have been able to do over the last 4 years has really been contingent on the expertise that these partners have really brought to the consortium. So the way that the program has been designed is very much to take advantage of that and to ensure that the added value of each partner is capitalized on. In terms of our coverage, we have been working in Mogadishu, in BRA, in Baidura and Afgoi, in Southwest State, and also Kismayo in Jubaland State. Our target has very much been displacement affected communities, so taking a very inclusive approach to solutions and ensuring that we are addressing challenges and specific displacement related vulnerabilities, not just for IDPs themselves, but also for their hosting communities, and also for returnees where they are also resident in the same population. So taking a very much area-based, inclusive approach to sustainable solutions. And particular attention through the lifespan of the program has also been given to the agency of vulnerable groups, including women and girls, and also youth as well. So particularly for some of our livelihoods components, making sure that the specific vulnerabilities related to these groups were very much integrated through those interventions design. So this is our pathway to reintegration and to reduce displacement in Somalia. So we see these as building blocks. It's not a linear process in the way that the arrow suggests, but we have illustrated in that way to hopefully give you some understanding of the different components and how they feed in. So very much kind of establishing an enabling environment, looking at community-driven planning processes and government leadership, so ensuring that the programme from the outset is community-driven and government-led has been critical to the successes and also to the learnings that we have generated through the programme. That has been layered with sustainable access to basic services, with land tenure security, which obviously we'll be focusing on in more detail in the next section, looking at more broadly at housing, land and property, and on top of that, layered with interventions focused on self-reliance and economic opportunities for displacement affected communities. The idea of these components is that it would ultimately result in progress towards increased reintegration and reduced displacement-related vulnerabilities for these targeted communities that we're serving. This diagram that we've shared on the right is our theory of change. So you can see our overall goal, as I mentioned, is the enhanced durable solutions towards reintegration and reduced displacement. And underneath that, we have our 4 key outcomes. The outcome at the bottom, as you can see, is focused on adaptive learning and management to inform durable solutions decision-making. So again, we have embedded this key tenet of learning through the whole programme to ensure that it influences not only our own programming interventions and our own adaptive approach, but also is supporting the government leadership, the government decision-making around durable solutions priorities, and also influencing other actors across the humanitarian development peace nexus and the donor community as well. So just to really emphasize this approach based on evidence, one of the things that we have developed through the lifespan of Danwadaag is analysis through a local reintegration assessment, which we have called LAURA. And this assessment has provided Danwadaag with the evidence base from which to reflect and adapt our own programming. And it has also provided us with the evidence base to also ensure this shift towards greater emphasis around housing, land and property. And it has also provided us with this evidence base to ensure that we have appropriate evidence to advocate for the inclusion of housing, land and property and these critical elements within the wider durable solutions agenda within Somalia, so within other actors' work as well. So this was a very intentional investment through the consortium, and it really has paid dividends in terms of helping us really unpack that question around what the end of displacement looks like and how we actually measure progress towards reduced displacement and reintegration in these urban centres that we're working. My last slide is the current model of the programme that we have now moved to. And as you can see, the sustainable integrated housing, land and property solutions are really at the centre of the work that we're doing. So the idea is that actually this provides the foundation and the pivot for all the other interventions that we are layering on top as Danwadaag. So this, again, very intentional, very much based on evidence from the programme, recognising that this critical importance of housing, land and property solutions. So I'm going to pause there and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Shezane from the Norwegian Refugee Council, who's going to walk you through the investments that Danwadaag have made in terms of housing, land and property. Thank you very much.
My name is Shezane Kirubi and I am the Information Counseling and Legal Assistance Specialist and Acting Durable Solutions Program Manager for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Somalia. So I will be taking you through some of the investments made by Danwadaag in housing, land and property, by also giving you an overview on some of our specific program approaches. So just to reiterate what Laura was saying, there are a multitude of challenges linked to accessing housing, land and property rights by displacement affected communities in Somalia. The HLP challenges are created by repeated and protracted displacements in urban areas, and they're exacerbated by the limited legal and policy frameworks around HLP rights. inadequate technical and functional capacities of state institutions, and weak mechanisms for the resolution of HLP disputes. Also, as Laura mentioned, the issue on forced eviction is quite a serious protection concern in Somalia, affecting the physical security, livelihoods, and most importantly, the search for durable solutions for displacement affected communities. So that is what we had in mind when we were designing our housing, land, and property interventions. And just a brief overview in terms of, so what are the core tenets of the housing, land, and property approach that is embedded within Danwadaag. The first aspect is integration. So HLP investments not only aimed to secure land tenure for displacement affected communities in order to avoid forced evictions, but they also strive to connect displacement affected communities to sustainable basic service delivery, affordable housing, and economic opportunities. The second aspect was being locally led. As you will see, and as I will talk through some of the interventions, investments were anchored in the foundation that the sustained protection of HLP rights and progress towards tenure security for displacement affected communities must be locally led. And also the government has quite a critical role to play in this. The third aspect was about being evidence-based and adaptive. So all HLP interventions were informed by evidence and learning to assess the evolving needs within such a dynamic context like Somalia. So our work was based on evaluating what is working and consistently adapting it over time. The fourth aspect is most of all the interventions and all investments made were targeted and focused. And my colleague Lena will take you through the local reintegration assessment, because all investments were benchmarked against local physical, material, and legal norms to tailor solutions to displacement specific vulnerabilities and needs. The fifth aspect is that investments were expert guided and replicable. So most of the HLP investments were informed by NRC's own information counseling and legal assistance team and into other international standards to ensure that displacement affected communities at the end of the day can claim and exercise their HLP rights at different stages of their displacement. Lastly, majority of our interventions were innovative. So we aimed to challenge the status quo, to identify and enable early stage innovations and scale effective programs to unlock solutions and opportunities for greater value for money. And you will see that all throughout my presentation. So through Danwadaag, more than 129,000 people have benefited from HLP services, and another 51,000 people have acquired land tenure security in Mogadishu, Kismayu, and Baidoa. In overall, HLP interventions supported under Danwadaag were 1, focused on eviction monitoring, prevention, and response. 2, support for government-led eviction prevention initiatives, such as the establishment of locally led eviction task forces in project locations. 3, advocacy on access to land and negotiation for informed tenure arrangements. 4, facilitation of dignified relocations for displacement-affected communities. 5, facilitation on the provision of land tenure documents at both household and group levels. And 6, support for innovative projects such as the rental subsidy project and site decongestion efforts in Mogadishu, community-led initiatives such as supporting IDPs that purchased land in Baidoa. And we will go through that in more detail. Then the last but not least, we also focused on improving access to information by employing locally appropriate methods to navigate obstacles that are linked to the enjoyment and exercise of HLP rights, while also trying to facilitate the resolution of HLP disputes through collaborative and community-driven approaches. So just in terms of a flagship program of Danwadaag was the Barwako site, the development of the Barwako site. So to start with, in 2018, the Baidoa municipality assigned the Barwako site to support the reintegration of displacement affected communities that were at highest risk of forced evictions. As we all know, in 2017, majority of the drought displaced moved to major urban areas, and Baidoa was among them. The Baidoa local authorities then collaborated with IOM and Danwadaag partners to support this initiative. An interministerial task force under the overall leadership of the municipality led the development of the new site. And the Barwaco Integrated Settlement accommodates both IDPs and host communities. The development of the site was done by a wide range of different actors, and really Barwaco is an example of how we've operationalized the humanitarian development peace-building nexus. During the first phase in 2019, 1,000 households, which is about 6,000 individuals, were relocated and provided with plots of land to help them and vouchers to help them construct their shelters of choice. Then during the second phase in 2021, another 1,009 households were relocated to the site. All these households have indeed received tenure documents. And there's a specific, to learn more about Barwaco, there's a specific learning event next week, in the next 2 weeks, that will go into more detail on the Barwaco site and the learning from that. So another critical component of Danwadaag was the facilitation of formal tenure documentation for displacement-affected communities. Establishing formal tenure documents and facilitating written arrangements is crucial for preventing forced evictions for displacement-affected communities. Formal land tenure documentation is evidence of the legal right of a displaced person to occupy their land. So written tenure documents essentially provide valuable proof for use in statutory courts or even during the resolution of disputes using alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. The local municipality in all project locations has a responsibility to oversee tenure arrangements, including any agreement between landowners and IDPs. So for example, with community-owned and private land, IDP leaders and landowners are required to enter a contractual agreement before engaging in any land transaction. The landowner is also required to issue an offer letter that is the basis of drafting a communal agreement, hence formalizing the land tenure arrangement. So parties to this agreement are then referred to the municipality offices, and with the assistance of a public notary, the written agreement is notarized and registered. And for public land like Barwaco, a written offer needs to be issued by the municipality. So that is the basis of issuing the title deeds for individual households. So during the project period, Danwadaag has facilitated access to tenure documents for more than 33,000 individuals. And of these individuals, 2,723 households now have their title deeds. So this is in Kismayu and in Baidoa. For the tenure arrangements, we're including communal tenure arrangements, rental contracts in Mogadishu, and so communal tenure arrangements and rental contracts in Mogadishu. Another interesting initiative that was supported under Danwadaag is in Baidoa, and it's a community-led land tenure model. Interestingly enough, during the project period, we realized that there were several instances where IDPs that were at highest risk of forced evictions were pooling resources together to purchase land. So this is a preventive measure aimed at minimizing HLP violations like forced evictions. And this approach empowers displaced people to avoid opportunistic arrangements inherent in IDP settlement dynamics, especially in an urban area like Baidoa. So what we did was a mapping where we identified 52 sites in which IDPs had come together to purchase land through communal contributions. These IDPs mostly bought land in Hanano and EDC zones of Baidoa town. Now, some of the IDPs have relocated to the new locations, while others are still dependent on assistance from the state and humanitarian agencies. And the support that is required to relocate these IDPs include relocation and housing support, provision of non-food items, water, sanitation and hygiene assistance, and education support. So under Danwadaag supported 3 sites in which IDPs had purchased land. And the investment that was made includes facilitation of land tenure documents, verification of land transactions by a public notary, site planning, land surveys and demarcation, relocation support, provision of HLP specialized information sessions, construction of shallow wells, and provision of hygiene kits. So before I go into the video, I would also like to highlight some of the challenges that we experienced while supporting this model. One is the limited access to land. We realized that most of the IDPs were purchasing really small plots of land, which is smaller than the required sphere standard minimum, which is 45 square meters per person in camp type like settlements. And then another key challenge was potential congestion. We realized that even amongst those that had purchased land, there were additional families that were not initially there that also moved to the new sites. So there was danger of potential congestion in such small areas. Then the third key challenge was limited funding. There was limited funding for basic infrastructure like schools, health centers, markets, and community centers. So what Danwadaag did since then has shared this, the locations with other partners to be able to target these sites for infrastructure development. So, and there's also need for increased sensitization and awareness of dark communities, especially when it comes to general land acquisition and transfer procedures. And this is what we will also consider within the next phase of Danwadaag. So we will now watch a very short clip that shows you what this model is all about.
markii koow rafaad horto oo dhibaato gaaja ugu soo barakacnay kusmaaya markaan imaanay xaafad meelaan degnayn oo daabiyaanba la dhahay agtiisaan degnaynin dhulka maxaanan dhahaynaa dhulkan ku guura.
As we all know, there had been eviction cases in Kismayu. It has increased recently, and most of the IDPs affected have inadequate housing, face challenges in sustainable livelihood, and other challenges within the camps.
Dhulkan oo hadda aan deganahay ay maaragtay aan soo degno hore maanan lahayn dhul oo sharci ah oo anaga aan degi jirnay, laakiin hadda waxaan ku degnay maaragtay sharci 5 sano ah. 5taas sano NRC waxay noo samaysay inay guryo noo dhisto. Hore waxaan ku jiri jirnay bac iyo baakad iyo loor. Alxamdulillah guryo deegaan ee NRC noo samaysay lacag 500 lacagaan la siiyay. Nin walba gurigiisa oo nadiif ah ayuu dhistay.
RC iyo commissionka guddo meel la fariistay meel markaa la fariistay dhul baa noo raadiyeen dhulka markaa noo raadiyeen ninkii dhulka leh loo saxiix dhacay markaa saxiix dhacay oo dhulka haddana dhulkaana noo soo guuriyay markaana noo soo guuriyay oo intana na keenay maasha Allah RC mahad shukra ugu mahad elinaynaa hadaa isdhacan qabnay hadaa rafaadan qabnay meeshii degnayna waan rafaadsanayna alxamdulillah shukru meeshina na keenay rafaad ma jiro hadaa isdhacan ma qabno iskufsan ma qabno.
Besides Danwadaag investing in long-term solutions such as the Barwako relocation site or supporting IDPs that have purchased land, we've also invested in medium-term solutions to address the issue of forced evictions. And here I want to now zero in on Kismayu, what we are calling incremental tenure. Incremental tenure is a practice that acknowledges the fact that tenure is a process and not a fixed system. It also acknowledges that both formal and informal land rights are fraught with challenges for displacement-affected communities in Somalia. In this instance, investments in infrastructure were leveraged to negotiate for 5-year rent-free leases for IDPs in Kismayu that were at highest risk of forced evictions. Investments in these camps would essentially contribute to increasing the value of land by providing physical infrastructure, by providing physical infrastructure inputs and upgrades to the IDP sites. Landowners would therefore be more inclined to provide unutilized land at no cost. The expansion and the demand for urban businesses and residential construction around these sites would then also further increase the value of the IDP leasehold land. So as you can see from my slide, I will zero in on a case study where we first started this approach with 2 camps in Kismayu, Camp Hashi and Camp Manamofi. Camp Hashi is home to 78 households, and it was first situated on government-owned land, while Manamofi was situated on private property and currently hosts 95 households. Both informal settlements combined host a total of 1,038 individuals, and they lived in the area for over 20 years before facing the threat of evictions. Once these camps received eviction notices, then the eviction task force led by the Jubaland Commission for Refugees and IDPs, together with the municipality and NRC, actively reached out to the landlords to access alternative land for these households. 2 landlords who are willing to give out their land were then identified, and both landowners at first were only willing to sign 3-year communal land agreements. So after several negotiations with the landowners, where we introduced this approach where we leveraged potential investments that would essentially increase the value of the land, both landowners were then willing to sign on 4-year and 5-year communal tenure agreements for both Hashi and Manamofi. So the involvement of local authorities throughout this whole process was central to the success of securing longer leases for the displacement-affected communities. Since then, by seeing success with these 2 camps, Danwadaag has then scaled this up to 8 other camps. And investments by Danwadaag include housing support, which is through cash for housing rehabilitation, site planning and decongestion, and also construction of shallow wells and facilitating public-private partnerships to access sustainable water for households that were situated in the camps at subsidized tariffs. So we will now watch another video just to show you what So after Kismayu, I want to now go into forced evictions, and also because this was a critical element of our program. So most of the evictions, as Laura had previously mentioned, in Somalia are driven by insecure tenure, inadequate legal and policy frameworks, and weak rule of law. The 3 most cited reasons for evictions in Somalia are the desire for owners to develop their properties, irregular and arbitrary increase of rental fees, and the inability of tenants to fulfill their rental obligations. So I'm going to zero in on Baidoa because Baidoa is an interesting case study for us to look at. From 2017, Baidoa has recorded the 3rd highest level of documented forced evictions in Somalia, following 2 districts in Mogadishu. In 2017, Baidoa received the largest number of drought-displaced persons, with the majority forced to either create new unplanned sites or join existing IDP settlements without secure land tenure arrangements. Consequently, in 2018, Baidoa then experienced its highest number of forced evictions to date. But what is interesting about Baidoa, as you will see, is that in 2019, there was a 39% decrease in the number of forced evictions recorded and a further 22% decrease in 2020. So why did this happen? This was because of increase in eviction prevention initiatives that were taking place in Baidoa. In April 2020, due to advocacy efforts by the Somalia Housing, Land and Property Area of Responsibility and the Resident Coordinator's Office, a moratorium during the COVID-19 period was enforced in Baidoa. In May 2020, the Baidoa District Administration actually agreed to the moratorium and consequently issued an official directive suspending any evictions during the pandemic for an initial period of 3 months. Since then, the moratorium has been extended twice, from May 2020 to March 2021. And the focus has even expanded not only to include COVID-19, but also other elements that are relevant for the context, such as drought and conflict. So from August 2020 to March 2021, please note that there was a significant reduction in the number of forced evictions being recorded in Baidoa. For a period of 9 months, we actually saw 0 forced evictions being committed. So as you can see from your first graph, graph 1, which is on your left-hand side, the eviction trends by month, this shows you the number of forced evictions per month, but you'll see the decline and no forced evictions being reported from August 2020. This is the first time that this has ever happened since eviction monitoring started in Somalia. So it's quite a significant success. Then the graph 2 on your right hand side shows you the annual prevention trends. So as you can see, as you're comparing how evictions are declining, the eviction prevention element is also increasing. And this is because the local authorities in Baidoa realized that eviction prevention is critical to reducing the number of forced evictions in Baidoa. So what are some of the activities that were carried out? So in Somalia, we know that eviction programming can be responsive or preventive. So I'm going to focus more on the preventive aspect. So eviction prevention initiatives require a cross-sectoral approach that involves government, humanitarian, development, and community stakeholders. But we also need to include the landowners and the affected populations. And the advantage of such an approach is critical for achieving durable solutions, but it also allows us to have a holistic approach with diverse sets of expertise and areas of influence to be able to come together and work on various aspects of displacement at different levels. So the situation in Baidoa, for example, demonstrates a sort of good practices that offers valuable case study of how coordinated multi-stakeholder and government-led eviction prevention initiatives can be effective as complementary measures in addressing HLP issues. So as you can see from my slide, the first element that we have also scaled up to other locations was the establishment of an eviction task force in Baidoa. And since then, a task force has also been established in Kismayu. So both task forces have clear terms of reference and are chaired by the government. In Baidoa, the task force is chaired by the Southwest Commission for Refugees and IDPs, and in Kismayu, it is chaired by the Juba Land Commission for Refugees and IDPs. Danwadaag has supported these task forces not only with technical assistance, but also has supported the task forces to hold monthly coordination meetings, which has led to well-coordinated preventive engagements, daily outreach and field visits to identify IDP sites that are at highest risk of evictions in order to trigger immediate response, but also to reach out to the landowners for negotiation, routine mediation and negotiation meetings to resolve land disputes, and joint eviction risk analysis in order to identify the sites that are at highest risk. The second element was through advocacy. So Danwadaag, as I mentioned, advocated for the extension of the moratorium in Baidoa that was first enforced in May 2020. The moratorium, as I said, has since then been extended twice, and the focus has expanded to go just beyond COVID-19 and include conflict and drought. The third element is through multi-stakeholder HLP forums on forced evictions, which has essentially increased communication between landowners and IDP communities. And we've seen that this could help parties identify and understand the complex dynamics, issues, and needs that affect each of them. As I said, for you to have effective eviction prevention, you need a multi-stakeholder approach. And such forums enabled different actors to come together to really discuss the issues at hand. There were 2 forums that were held in Baidoa. One was in September 2020, and the other one was in March 2021 under the leadership of the Baidoa municipality and the Southwest Commission for Refugees and IDPs. Then through scaling up efforts on dispute resolution, Danwadaag also facilitated and supported mediation and negotiations to resolve land disputes, but the program also strengthened existing community structures on dispute resolution. This means that even at the end of the project, these structures will still remain in place to be able to solve land disputes even after exit. Then the 5th element was improved access to tenure security for IDPs. And as I already said, the first element was the Barwako, which was a good example. The second was supporting IDPs that had purchased land. But also through eviction prevention, we were also able to extend lease agreements. And for example, under Danwadaag in 2020, the Eviction Task Force negotiated for the extension of lease agreements for 19 IDP sites and facilitated the issuance of written tenure agreements for another 37 settlements that had relied on oral agreements with the landowners. Then another critical aspect on eviction prevention was to invest in research. We needed to make sure that we're able to document some of these initiatives that were happening in Baidoa to be able to scale up in other locations, as I mentioned, like in Kismayo or in Mogadishu. So through Danwadaag and also through co-funding from ECHO, we were also able to investigate the forced eviction phenomena in Baidoa and document some of the good practices. And since then, this report is widely available on NRC's website and on the Danwadaag website. From all that I have said in terms of eviction prevention, we also wanted to show the value for money in terms of some of the activities that we were essentially supporting. So as I said, eviction programming can either be responsive or preventive. So the slide that is in front of you, you're able to see a comparative analysis of the situation if the households were evicted in one instance versus if eviction prevention engagements took place. So we zeroed in for what is in front of you. This is just a snippet of some of the costs and not all the costs. But we zeroed in Kismayo, where we were implementing the integrated HLP approach, where we were leveraging investments. And in order to deduce a value for money analysis, we estimated the costs of what we would have spent on if these households were evicted versus what we spent on the integrated approach. So in this case, we took the costs of investing in the shallow wells, in the cost of investing in infrastructure like the latrines, the site planning, the housing rehabilitation costs, versus the cost that we would have spent if these households were evicted. So if these households were evicted, essentially that would trigger an emergency response. So some of the costs would include a post-eviction support package through an emergency grant fund, emergency water tracking, provision of non-food items, provision of emergency shelter, provision of latrines, etc. So we came to realize that the cost of the integrated HLP approach in Kismayo is significantly lower than the cost of what it would have taken for us to respond if these same households were evicted. And other costs that we also need to consider that are not in front of you, but you should also be thinking about at the back of your mind, is that other costs that we could not estimate was disruption to the life routines of this household. So for example, what we've seen based on trends and also past experience, 80% of households that usually go through forced evictions can no longer send their children to school due to transport costs or due to that kind of disruption to their livelihoods. Essentially, if these households also had any type of livelihood activities, we assume that it would cost them 3 times the cost it took to set up their businesses from scratch. Essentially, there are also other costs such as asset loss. For example, when forced evictions take place, it usually comes with a lot of violence. So there's destruction of housing, there's destruction of wash investments such as latrines, boreholes, shallow wells. And we are also assuming that this household would not essentially only be evicted once, but they would be constantly in a vicious cycle. So essentially, based on our own experience, we've seen that households can be evicted even at least 3 times. So that just gives you an estimate of some of the costs we would have spent if these same households were evicted versus the cost that we spent in trying to negotiate for longer term leases and tenure arrangements and having this integrated approach in place. Then lastly, another interesting approach was actually piloted by the local partner NoFYL, and they were implementing a camp coordination, camp management in situ approach in 5 sites in Mogadishu, and they were working with the community to redesign the sites to improve the living conditions. So through the reconfiguration of the sites and better use of the space, this allowed for more space between shelters, larger access to roads, latrines, waste management, and greater accessibility to site services and addressing protection and safety concerns. So we're going to watch a very interesting video from NoFYL just so you can see what this approach is all about.
degmadayna waxay ka mid tahay degmooyinka ay ku nool yihiin barakacyaal badan kuwaas oo meelahay deganayeen ay kasoo barakiciyeen abaaro qaarkood ay kasoo barakiciyeen colaado qaarna ay kasoo barakiciyeen daadad iyo arrimo kale badan ay isugu jiraan.
So there are currently over 2,000 IDP sites across Somalia, and around half of those are really overcrowded. As the land people are forced to settle on is informal, it often means that there's no good site planning. It means there's no proper waste management, and sanitation is really poor. That means that disease spreads through the camp, and for women and girls, it will be really dangerous to access latrines at night.
kaamkaan dhibaato hoog leh aan ka qabnaa meel ilmaha wax kuugu unaan aan lahayn meel barrad oo aad wax ka dhagata dhar aad ka dhagata aan lahayn
masquulihii guri waa saaran yihiin cariiriya isku qabnaa dhibaatada kale waxa waay qof xanuunsanayo meel aan marinaysid male luuq waaye jidka meel laba qof isku dhaafaysa male
masquulna ma haysan feela lagu jiro masquulihii yar waay hadda mar hore ay ahaayeen waaba dudumeen
qashanka ber loo maareeyba ma laha waa la haaqa guriga dhaxdiisa iska sii dhigayna meel kale loo kala mooreeyba ma jirto oo la geeyo
dhulka ay dadka ku nool yihiin horta waa dhul dad shakhsiyaad ay leeyihiin ama aysan ayagu iska lahayn in markasta oo qofka dhulka iskala u soo baaxdo dadkaas inay dhulka ka guuraan noqoto.
daaqada qab alxamdulillah albaabiyana insaar ma sha Allah hadii rabna qofka inoo saaradaan hadii fal birta gashadaan ee iska bahaan soo daneysdaan ma sha Allah waan ka ineen sugan hada nafisa halni meeshi alaabta ka dhigdaan gooni waay meeshi dharka dhagadaan gooni waay meeshi cuntada ka karsadaan gooni waay
waxaan ku dooranaa waxa kamid ah heshiiska ay haystaan oo waqti dheer ah iyo ayagoo cariiri zaa'id ah kaam guriga isarsaariin zaa'id ah wax ugu horeeya aan sameeyno waxa waay dadkii kaamka deganaa kaamka shanta kaamka ka shaqeynayno dadkooda inaan la kulannay community mobilization aan sameeyno dadka centerska isku keenay waa ka dhaadhicin hawsha meeshan ka qabrabno iyo faa'iidada u leedahay nagala qayb qaateen ra'yigooda noo sawireen
oo 3 mitir aan nolol dhisay faraaga waasa ah nolol dhisay oo nidaam sharaf leh nolol dhisay
أول قشن مالش أمرتيد باللوقي مرتيد بقشن يا قدافة وهنجري هذا اللوقي أمرته وضدي أمرته نظيف واي فرجيدان قانينا قشن قاسكوسينا جاريا يلا كشبينا قدك وينا ناقد واقيننا قدك اسكي شبينا نظيف هذا ما شاء الله نظافة هاي سنة
shaqadan hadda anaga 5 kaambas ka sameeyno oo target noo ahaayeen meel kasto ka jira cariiri kaamamka qolkiiba 9 kaamamka dhan ku yaal magaalada banaankeeda iyo ku gudaha ku yaalaba cariiri guriga hoosta iskaga jiraan marka shaqadan waxa waa shaqo u baahan in la baraariyo oo in lagu taageero u baahanahay.
Supporting sustainable solutions for these displacement challenges together with the local authorities is important for stability and peace, not only in Somalia, but across the entire region. Those displaced from their homes deserve to have a more sustainable and safer future. That's why the UK is committed to supporting this important work.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Lena, the Deputy Consortium Coordinator and responsible for learning and change, and I will walk you through the impact, what we have learned, and what the collective opportunities are. As Laura explained earlier, how we use the local reintegration assessment, or short LoRA, to inform and adapt our programming, land tenure security in our earlier LoRA assessments proved to be a significant aspect for inequalities between IDPs and host communities, meaning it is a key displacement-specific vulnerability to be addressed for durable solutions. Having put land tenure security and housing solutions at the core of our program, based on this evidence, and layering other multi-sectoral interventions on its top, Danwadaag managed to have impact. When we started, 37% of IDPs said they felt well integrated. As of late 2021, 65% of IDPs in our areas of programming reported to feel well integrated, an increase by almost 30%. 22% less IDPs now live in makeshift shelters. 8% now have written documentation for the land they occupy. 20% more IDPs can now access food sources, and 7% more households now have a daily expenditure over 1.9 USD, which we use as a proxy for income. Overall, the inequalities between host communities and IDPs have significantly reduced with regards to physical, material, and legal safety, which also means that the displacement-specific vulnerabilities of IDPs have reduced. There is still a lot of work to be done, especially with regards to increasing IDPs' trust in institutions, and there is work to be done with regards to social cohesion and education. What have we learned? We have learned that sustainable land and housing solutions are paramount for achieving durable solutions. We've also learned that integrated programming is key, layering interventions on top of one another for greater impact. What does this actually mean? The large majority of IDPs continue to live in makeshift shelters, but having a house alone is not enough. IDPs also need land tenure security, and for them to be integrated and self-reliant, this needs to be paired with access to sustainable basic services and economic opportunities. For example, a key barrier for IDPs to access loans is the lack of identity documentation and assets, as well as the low social status, meaning that they do not have anyone willing to be their guarantor. When IDPs now have land title deeds, they can leverage these as assets to access loans. Usually, in some of our areas of operation, in the process of Danwadaag assisting them to receive land title deeds, identity documentation is a part of that. Land title deeds also increase IDPs' social capital, increasing the likelihood of these IDPs to integrate, and being able to meaningfully engage in community decision-making processes. Therefore, securing land tenure can be an important catalyst for financial inclusion and financial opportunities. Reducing displacement makes already vulnerable populations even more vulnerable. It incapacitates the usual coping mechanisms and social support networks. They often not only are evicted once, but multiple times and over a protracted period of time. And many IDPs never even return to the place where they were displaced from. Ensuring land tenure security and adequate housing disrupts the cycle of repeated evictions and insecurity and enables these IDPs to progress towards integration, slowly building up their self-reliance. For durable solutions, it is not only important to ensure integrated programming, but with regards to HLP, also not to focus on one specific HLP intervention type only, but instead it is good to use a breadth of interventions to respond to the specific needs and different stages of vulnerability, while capitalizing on the opportunities as they arise in different contexts. On the top of the slide towards the right, you can see an HLP intervention decision-making tree that we have developed. And although you might not be able to see all the details of it because it is very small, the intention of us putting it here is rather to show you how complex the different intervention types and the pathway to making the decisions which intervention type to choose actually is. For any of these interventions, government buy-in and government leadership is absolute key. For example, during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the time was ripe to engage the government in the development of an eviction moratorium in Baidoa that my colleagues talked about earlier, and for it to be enforced. Although it was only a temporary measure, it led to eviction prevention, as mentioned earlier, and it enabled Durable Solutions and other stakeholders to look for alternative, more long-term measures in the meantime, such as supporting the eviction task force, working with landowners to extend lease agreements, or relocating IDPs to government-allocated land. Similarly, the success with our Babako relocation site in Baidoa, this would not have been possible without government leadership and the government investing in this process. This means that while assisting communities and households towards tenure security, improved housing, and exercising IDPs' rights is paramount, coordination and increasing displacement-affected communities' trust in institutions and civic institutions, which we know from evidence is the most important aspects for IDPs to feel integrated, is also very important. Communities should be seen as active participants rather than passive recipients in these government-led processes. Community-based planning processes dovetailed into district planning, as we have done in our program, can be a way to meaningfully engage these communities in decision-making processes. For HLP specifically, owner-driven cash-based modalities for shelters, for example, or involving communities in the reconfiguration and decongestion of sites can be helpful to ensure this ownership. While government-led solutions are key, it is also important to continue to engage private landowners for medium-term solutions, as the majority of IDPs continue to squat on private land without tenure documentation. This can be achieved by leveraging infrastructure or other types of investments against land tenure security, which we successfully piloted in Danwadaag under our program. To enhance these processes, it is crucial that we base our investments on evidence and that we continuously monitor progress. Danwadaag's approach to move away from international standards, looking for an adequate means of comparison for IDPs' physical, material, and legal safety has led to us looking at the surrounding host communities as a good means of comparison. Using this unique approach in light of the needs constantly outstripping the resources in Somalia, and looking at the host communities as a standard of comparison has enabled us to understand in greater detail what the displacement-specific needs and vulnerabilities are and how we could address these. For HLP specifically, it also allowed us to understand which types of interventions would be suitable for which subsets of population. It also enabled us to zoom in on the location-specific context to tailor the programming accordingly. Doing this, we were able to implement a multitude of HLP interventions to meet the needs for the short, medium, and long-term solutions related to evictions, to tenure security, to housing challenges, and HLP rights violations. Incorporating legal experts, paralegals, into these interventions was very critical, as they were able to link components of eviction prevention, HLP rights information and counseling, dispute resolution, and policy development. So what are the collective opportunities? They are supporting the design of a national land policy, moving towards enacting the Land Act. They're also developing frameworks, guidelines, and best practice for effective land administration and land governance. They are strengthening further access to justice for vulnerable populations through improved access to legal services and assistance, including for HLP-related matters. They are also further strengthening local dispute resolution knowledge and techniques informed by a rights-based approach, and further promoting the right to adequate housing and to develop housing typology policies that adequately outline the rights and protection needs of displaced persons. Investing into longer-term solutions to displacement, starting with HLP, recognizing the fact that long-term solutions without tenure security and without integrated programming might not be viable. Putting in place frameworks that allow us to operationalize short, medium, and long-term solutions in parallel, and forging strategic partnerships across the humanitarian development and peace nexus, and even more importantly, with local stakeholders.
So we have received some questions from the participants. One of the questions one of the participants is asking, so one of the activities highlighted in eviction prevention is the stakeholder forums, which bring together different actors, including landowners. As we know, land is an economic asset that should be earning returns for the landowners. And with the eviction moratorium in place, what incentives were provided to the landowners for the opportunity cost of land? Anyone?
I can answer that.
Go ahead.
So just to clarify, the eviction moratorium was only enforced in Baidoa. That's where we saw written communication from the municipality. So, and the leveraging of investments was piloted in Kismayu. So just to clarify that point. And then also just to mention, a moratorium was only enforced during an emergency period. So that was during the pandemic. So moratoriums are not sustainable in the long run. What we need to be pushing for is having very clear legal and policy frameworks in place. Interestingly enough, the Southwest state just recently passed the urban land law in Baidoa. And when you look at that law specifically, there's a chapter on forced evictions, which is in line with the national eviction guidelines. So the next step will be to see how we can support the local municipality in actually enforcing that law, and also better educating private landowners what it means when it comes to the national being at par with the national eviction guidelines, but also what the land law is stating. So it's important to remember that evictions is a legal remedy for landowners. However, it is how they are conducted that's what makes it forced and illegal. So if there's no adequate notice that is provided, and according to the eviction guidelines and the land law in Baidoa, it is 60 days. So if that is not done, then that makes it illegal. If the use of force is used, then that's what makes it illegal or forced. So it's important to understand that element when we're talking about eviction moratoria in Somalia.
Thank you, Shezane. I think
maybe I could just add in,
go ahead.
If that's all right, Andrew. And I think one more point, just in terms of what we have been implementing as Danwadaag, and we were proposed to bring to scale in the next phase as well, is a simplified version of land value capture in practice. Effectively, what we are doing is negotiating with landowners for stronger land tenure security, and in return, what they get are investments which increase the value of their land. So instead of evicting IDPs and getting, either selling the land or renting it at a higher price to other residents, what they are providing is a longer land tenure security. We are striving right now to ensure at least 5 years on all the contract negotiations that we're doing, so that the IDPs get 5 years in terms of land tenure security, and in return the landowners do get that increased value in terms of their land because of the investment in sustainable basic services.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Evans. He has another question tied to the first. And it goes, could eviction moratorium increase new settlements, as the IDPs know that they will not be evicted from the land they have settled on, which may be a recipe for future land conflicts?
So thanks, Evan, for that question. So I think it's good to just differentiate between the phenomena on camp splitting, which is what you're talking about in terms of IDP splitting, and eviction moratoria. So as I said, eviction moratorium was only enforced as a preliminary measure to prevent forced eviction during a specific period, but it's not sustainable in the long run. However, even though the eviction moratorium wasn't enforced, we still have this phenomenon known as camp splitting. And I know IOM, CCCM partners have done a lot of work in terms of trying to investigate what that phenomenon is. The first aspect is to work with local authorities really to understand why this camp split. Sometimes it's because different IDP camp leaders would want to get more resources in terms of responding to the people that are living in those camps. And other times it's also driven by arguments between an IDP camp leader and his deputy. So there are different reasons why camps split. So I would advise if you could also go online and access the forced eviction study in Baidoa. It talks a little bit more about that phenomena. And also we will ask our CCM partners to share more on what they've been doing right now in terms of trying to even figure out what does an IDP site mean in Somalia.
All right, thank you so much, Shezane, for that. Any more comments from?
No, I think that's great.
All right, so move on. I also encourage if there are more further any other questions, kindly put that in the chat as well. There was one question I think that was shared beforehand around adaptive evidence-based programming. And the participant is asking, how did you balance the shift, or how did Danwadaag balance the shifts with the initial program? You know, every time you do a proposal, it's more or less set in stone. You have to follow that. So how did you go about using that evidence to pivot away from what was initially proposed?
Thanks, Andrew. Maybe I can respond to that, and then my colleagues may have something to add. Yes, Danwadaag was an extremely adaptive program, and we were very lucky, I think, with the donor partner that we were working with FCDO, who very much understood the dynamic nature of the context in Somalia, and also understood that what we were trying to achieve was this very iterative approach that is based on evidence, and so therefore evolving as we went made sense. Now, that was something that was not necessarily easy to achieve, and took a lot of understanding, I think, from the partners' perspectives as well, doing multiple revisions of budgets, of work plans, etc., based on evidence as it materialized from the program. So it was a real commitment, I think, to that adaptive approach that really, from all the stakeholders involved in the program, that really made it a success, I have to say.
And I can add, I think two examples from that of how we were able to adapt is the example I gave on how we were supporting IDPs that purchase land. At the very beginning of the program, this was not an initiative under Danwadaag, but then when we really got into the cracks of it in terms of understanding the context, we realized that there are IDPs who are actually coming together to purchase land. So how can we support them in this? And how do we support the local municipality? The other approach was what we piloted in Kismayu. At first, this whole arrangement of leveraging investments wasn't initially at the beginning of Danwadaag, but then when we had to revise based on changes in the context, but also changes in the budget, we realized, why don't we leverage the investments in order to get these 5-year rent-free leases? And something interesting that Laura mentioned is not only is the value of land increasing, but most of the time these settlements are located on the periphery areas they're located on peri-urban areas or the periphery of the town. So what essentially happens when the value of land increases, or when there's increase in businesses or housing around that area, then that settlement becomes part of the town. So it's a really important point, and that is why you'll see that landowners will be more inclined to provide that land at no cost for a certain period of time. Yeah.
And maybe to add one aspect is that this is also true for the kind of dual approach that the program took between early solutions or a crisis modifier and long-term durable solutions, because, and again, reiterating what Laura said, that we were also lucky with FCDO being our donor, being relatively flexible. Of course, in an environment where there's constant changes, where there's also a lot of emergency situations, drought, floods, etc. Although our program is durable solutions and working towards long-term solutions, there is a lot of need to also respond to emergency needs. And with this dual approach, we were able to do so, doing early solutions or crisis modifier component in our program in order to protect the kind of long-term gains and to make sure that any of these emergencies didn't hamper this progress towards durable solutions that we're aiming at.
Oh, fantastic. And what I hear from that is there is a real reliance on data and evidence, which we'll, of course, again, discuss next Wednesday. Yes, not to put too much of a finer point on that. Maybe one of the questions around learning basically is what didn't work, and how did you program around what didn't work?
Yeah, great question, I think. Lena just referred to the crisis modifier or the early solutions component that we built in. We didn't start the program design with that, in fact. We started the program design looking at more longer-term sustainable. We quickly realized about 6 months into the program that actually what we needed to do was incorporate this flexibility within the program to actually respond to these immediate needs when they happen, when we see these drought displacement influxes into these primary centers, into the areas, the communities that we're targeting. We need to be able to buffer them from that shock. And that was something that we realized and quickly course corrected on. And now for phase 2, that is something that is integrated from the outset into the program design. So I think that was one really critical thing that we realized pretty early on. I think another thing that we realized as we were moving through the process of the Bawako relocation, which both of my colleagues have referred to, after the first phase, we were just of 1,000 households were relocated. We were just starting on the second phase of relocating another 1,000 households when there was some land contestation from the communities. So they began protesting and saying, actually, you know, we haven't agreed to this. This is land that we're using for other purposes. And at that point, we needed to take a step back as a consortium and really sit down with the government and with the local authorities and the president of Southwest State and say, you know, this is a critical challenge. We cannot move forwards with this intervention, with this relocation project, without an appropriate solution for these land claims. And ultimately, the president of Southwest State and the authorities were able to come up with an appropriate resolution to that, and to ensure that the communities were appropriately, what's the word I need? Like, informed, but also consulted, and they received some like measure of contribution for. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. I can't think of the word. Anyway, some restitution basically for these claims, in a way which made sense for the communities, in a way which made sense for the government of Southwest State. And that process actually delayed the second phase of relocation by a whole year. So I think for us, it was a really critical lesson learned that when it comes to issues of land, the government have to be first and foremost in that primary role of resolving these issues. We have to be working very much to support them to be able to find these solutions rather than trying to find them directly ourselves. Thanks.
Then maybe another example is in Banade region. We saw that while eviction prevention initiatives were very successful in Baidoa, but also in Kismayo, leading to a decline in forced evictions, we had the opposite effect in Banade, where we actually saw an increase in forced evictions, especially during 2021 towards the end of the year, but also right now in 2022 with the ongoing drought. That's not to say that we didn't do anything in Banadir, but what we learned was that we need to expand and strengthen the capacity of the eviction task force in Banadir region, but also expand it to the district level. So we need to work more with district commissioners when it comes to eviction prevention in order to have more successful results, as we've seen in other areas. And I think that is something that we are going to focus more on in phase 2 of the program, but also in any other funding that is coming in for that region.
Fantastic, thank you. So two last questions from the participants. One is from Abdullahi, who is asking how we know that landlessness and the land situation in Somalia affects both the displaced as well as the host. So how did you handle the social dynamics of all of this, noting that we are focusing on the displaced communities, but yet also the host community are displaced, are landless?
With all of our interventions, we made sure that the surrounding host communities also benefit from the basic services we were providing. And in Bawako, there is an example where in the end, a lot of, I don't want to say animosities, but I think a lot of mistrust. The host community didn't know, what does this mean? These IDPs are being relocated here. Does this mean maybe our already stretched resources will be even more stretched, etc., etc.? Whereas towards the end of the program, and when the IDPs had relocated, the host communities actually realized that it meant that they had increased access to resources and therefore were welcoming more IDPs to be resettled. But I think it's an important question, and it's always a balance to strike between reducing the displacement-specific vulnerabilities, but at the same time also taking a step back and looking at the overall vulnerabilities within the communities where we work.
So actually, of the relocated households, 10% were actually from the urban host community as well. So recognizing those critical vulnerabilities, as you've highlighted, Abdullahi, that really needs to be taken into consideration. But again, the way to do that is very much working through the government and the municipalities, because these are the citizens of those towns. So it's really important that that is a process of working through these critical stakeholders, the communities and the government themselves.
I have another question from Katie, and the question goes, what is your take on public land being offered by government for relocation and settlement of IDPs on temporary basis, in parentheses, 10 years?
So we really need to realize that when I was presenting, I also mentioned something known as incremental tenure. So we need to realize that tenure is a process. It's not a fixed system. So we need to work within a continuum where we recognize both informal and formal land rights. So if the government has given out land that is 10 years, which happens in a lot of areas such as Garowe and Bosaso, where the government gives out land for 10 or 15 years, we need to work around that, because the issue on land and access to land, especially in Somalia, is quite contentious and very sensitive. So we also need to support such initiatives, and where we have opportunities where government has given out land for permanently, then we are also happy, but these opportunities are rare. And as we said, Barwako is one example. In Kismayo, we have Midnimo and Medina. So there are not a lot of examples. And in a context like even in Mogadishu, we had to work around that, where land was not accessible, we had to come up with another way. And the other way was through rental subsidies, where we had rental contracts. So we shouldn't tie a particular period of time to land tenure security, and we need to work along this continuum. Yeah.
There are IDPs who may want to relocate permanently to a site such as Bawako, but there's also IDPs who, because of drought situations need to go to other places or are forcibly evicted or displaced, but they intend to return. So it also depends very much on the intentions of the IDPs that we're talking about.
This last question / comment comes from Farah, and he says, to his understanding, public lands are small in size and can accommodate the IDPs, and also government needs space for their ministries, which can't accommodate. I'm not sure what that, whether that was a question in there. But anyone wants to make some reflection about, I think, working with on public lands in Jubaland, state of Somalia?
So what's the question? Sorry.
So it's a comment that, to his understanding, public lands are small in size and may not be able to accommodate IDPs, and also government needs the space for ministries. So maybe a reflection on that.
Okay, so again, this goes back to what I just said. There are situations where public land will be available, and those are golden and rare opportunities. But we also need to start tailor, as Laura perfectly put it, we need to tailor our interventions informed by the context. So in Baidoa, for example, we have public land, we have situations where IDPs are also purchasing land, which we are also supporting. In Kismayo, where we haven't seen examples of IDPs purchasing land, we've tried to leverage investments to try and get longer term leases for IDPs, which wouldn't necessarily work in Baidoa. So we need to tailor it around the context and be informed about the context. Access to land in Somalia, again, is very complicated, it's very complex. So we won't always have examples where even the size of the land or there are even opportunities where land is being given out. So it depends on the context, and it needs to be really informed by consultations with the local authorities and consultations with the communities themselves.
All right.
And maybe just to add to that as well, Shezane referred to it earlier, we are seeing more and more encouraging signs in terms of land allocations within Somalia, and just maybe to mention, Jubaland authorities themselves have currently set aside a piece of land which is, I think, 3 kilometres by 5 kilometres, which is designated as another relocation, reintegration site, which again, I think just shows the leadership that we're seeing from the authorities in Somalia to really address this issue in a sustainable way that really does reduce displacement in the longer term.
The earlier question that we discussed with regards to adaptive management, I think in this point as well, again, the donor was very flexible. At some stage, we also had what we called an opportunity fund, meaning that we had some of the budget allocations held back for opportunities as they arose, meaning that if there was land made available, just an example, it's not necessarily all tied to HLP, but it meant that we had budget that we could then use in order to capitalize on this opportunity that came up, depending on the location, the context, government engagement, etc.
We really hope that you have taken away a few nuggets of information that you didn't know before, and we really would welcome your further engagement within the Danwadaag Consortium. So on your screen right now, you should be able to see the link to our website pages, which are hosted by the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat. So please do visit, do find out more information about the consortium, and also there is an email address there. So please do use it. We would love to hear from you. We would love to hear how you feel you could be further engaged within the program, and any additional feedback you might have on this event or other information you would like to know, please do reach out. Again, we would really welcome your engagement and your feedback on our work to date.